Welcome to the first episode of the new year. In this one, we're going to be looking at what's happening in Georgia and the worrying trend of increasing repression by Georgian Dream, the regime that falsified the elections and now is busy dismantling the last vestiges of a free democratic state in Georgia. Before we get to that, I wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone who has supported the channel throughout the year, especially those who've supported the campaign to buy a truck. We've only got a little bit left now. We're above 80% of that, and we really want to get that closed out early in the new year so we can get that truck delivered to Lviv so it can be made battle ready to obviously save Ukrainian lives. Thank you to everyone who's done that, and of course to people who have also helped our documentary film project. We're hoping to send the film crew out early in the new year, and we're almost at the initial target of $15,000 to be able to do that and create what's called the sizzle trailer to get the project onto the next stage. Thank you to everyone who has been supporting that. And before we jump into this episode, more news for the new year. We're going to be aiming to at least do daily Silicon Bites. There is so much news going on, so much analysis I think required, and there is so much excellent material actually in Russian language which isn't available to English language audiences. So much sort of depth of analysis and detail. We want to bring that to the audience of Silicon Curtain, so we are going to continue doing the interviews as well, but we are in addition going to be publishing a daily news summary episode or deep dive Silicon Bites news episode. So please do subscribe. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on those. Well, let's dive into today's subject. This is about the slide towards dictatorship in Georgia, which is accelerating. This episode will review the mechanics of laws that are marking an increasingly repressive and desperate regime in Georgia. As we've examined in previous episodes, the Georgian Dream Party has now ripped off the mask and shed any last vestige of ambiguity about whether they are or are not a Kremlin proxy party that is intent on deconstructing Georgia's fragile democracy and subverting institutions that have been evolving since independence to bring rule of law and civic liberties to society. Well, they quite clearly are a Kremlin proxy acting in the interests of Russia, not in the interests of Georgian citizens, and they are busy dismantling the state and its institutions. This episode will look at the increasingly punitive laws and actually the mechanics of how you go from a free democracy and actually start eroding freedoms, liberties on a whole range of different parts of society, how you deconstruct that society and the ability of people to resist an autocratic regime. I think this detail is incredibly important to understand, and it is a kind of toolkit of autocracy, so it's important to understand how it happens so we can fight its appearance in other countries as well, including our own. Here is a summary of the laws that have been brought in. This was posted on X by the excellent Anna Gavrishvili, who has been a recent guest on the channel. The following restrictions have been rushed into law and will take effect on December 30th. Drivers joining protests with the processions. If police determine such actions obstruct traffic, drivers will be fined 1,000 lari and have driving licenses suspended for a year. Number 2, unauthorized protest stencils, signs, posters. Fines for damaging the city's appearance have been increased from 50 lari and now are up to 1,000 in terms of the fines being imposed. Number 3, blocking roads during protests can lead to a fine on each individual person of 5,000 lari, a tenfold increase in the fine for this offence. Those deemed to be organisers can face fines of 15,000. This rule also applies to violations under Georgia's law on assemblies and demonstrations, including blocking building entrances. Instead of a fine, administrative detention of up to 15 days can be imposed. And this is, of course, very much following the Russian pattern of how any protests against the war in the early stages of 2022 were actually stamped on. So we can see them going down that same route. Number 5, possession of a laser or bright light emitting device, 2,000 lari fine. And to put it in context, these fines are extremely punitive, and whereas they will not necessarily be a deterrent to the protesters, nonetheless these are large sums of money for individuals to shoulder the burden of. Number 6, covering one's face with masks or other means will result in a 2,000 lari fine. Number 7, minors at protests. If a minor is deemed to have violated Article 173, that is disobedience to lawful police demands, their parents will be fined for improper upbringing, with fines ranging from 100 to 300 lari. This is the one I think that triggered me most, the one coming up, and the title of the episode is taken from number 8 in terms of the new laws being introduced. And it has extremely sinister connotations of the pre-crime detection unit in the science fiction book Minority Report. Number 8, preventative detention. Police can now detain individuals preventatively, assuming they may commit an offence based on prior violations. And where we have a state where the judiciary is being co-opted to serve political interests, not the interests of the people, this law is completely open-ended. It means that anyone can be detained for anything, and potentially for a period of time which is indeterminate. This is a blanket impunity for a regime to punish whoever it thinks may offer some resistance to its repression. Number 9, detention for court appearance. Police can detain individuals solely to ensure their appearance in court, even if they do not refuse to attend voluntarily. The provision allows police to detain someone even if no case has yet been filed in court. Again, when you take number 8 and number 9 together, this gives the government complete impunity to jail anyone they see fit under any grounds that they may want to make up. And of course, in a state where the judiciary increasingly is not impartial, many of the charges that eventually will get levelled against people may well be faked or false. These laws are also fairly ambiguous as well, which gives both the police and the government the power to pretty much do what they want. And finally, the summary of these laws, number 10, expanded grounds for personal and property searches. Personal searches, inspections of items, and confiscation of belongings and documents are now permitted under these same grounds. Even though Ivanishvili, the oligarch behind Georgian Dream, and the person who made his money in Russia, even though he made fireworks and face masks illegal, the people in Zugdidi, which is in western Georgia, have demonstrably used both of these in protests against the regime's draconian attempts to support peaceful protests and freedom of expression this week. So immediately these laws are adopted, you see people throughout Georgia already breaking them. And there are some interesting images on X as well of vast quantities of fireworks being sold on the street. Of course, some of those will be for New Year celebrations, but a lot will also be stockpiled, one assumes, for upcoming protests as well. There just does not seem to be enough appreciation of the illegitimacy of the new Georgian government by EU politicians, though, and the illegality of the decisions it's making. The actions of the Prime Minister and new President mark a significant deviation from the European path of development that most Georgians have sought for 3 decades. The rump Georgia Dream Parliament rubber-stamped the above legislation amendments to curtail dissent within the civil service as well and repress the mounting resistance to Georgian Dream's usurpation of power. Amendments were made to the Criminal Code, the Administrative Offences Code, Law on Assemblies and Demonstrations, and the Police and Civil Service laws. Through an urgent procedure, although these have not yet been fully enacted, they are expected to be rubber-stamped soon. They significantly increase the fines for protesters, as we've mentioned. They make it also easier to fire civil servants and expand the scope of political appointments in the civil service, and expand also the scope for extrajudicial detention, restrict the sale and use of pyrotechnics, and simplify new recruitment into the police force. Well, we'll come to that in a minute, because there are also implications for the degrading of quality of intake into the police force, as well as the training that they undergo. The restrictions follow intense protests in which demonstrators used green lasers and pyrotechnics in response to violent police dispersals. Many protesters cover their faces to protect from police identification amid massive arbitrary arrests, as well as alleged beatings and torture at the hands of extrajudicial mobs, titushki, and the police. As the intensified street protests in Georgia stretch into their second month, the ruling Georgia Dream Party's shift towards authoritarianism is extending beyond the use of violent police tactics and mass arrests to quell its critics. Legislative moves that are going through the processes at the moment seem designed to create the foundations and to buttress a full police state. The law on civil servants has been substantively amended following multiple petitions by civil servants who've spoken out against the Georgian Dream decision to deviate from EU accession. These changes should be read in the context of Georgian Dream Prime Minister Irakli Kobakhidze and Georgian Dream Secretary General Kazka Kaladze's references to the self-cleansing of the civil service, as civil servants have issued multiple pro-EU statements. Department heads and deputy heads will no longer be considered civil servants, but will be administratively contracted. This is a euphemism for political appointees. The amendment contradicts the principle of professional and independent public administration, which was the driving element of the 2015 law on civil service and was adopted in line with EU association criteria. So again, these moves are taking Georgia far away from its agreed process to join the EU and to align its practices with those of open law-based societies. It's moving very far away from that, and of course making it far less likely and more difficult to be able to join in future. Requalifying mid-level officials means significant limitations to their job security and subordination to political will. They can be fired with 1 month's notice without redress. The new appointments will no longer be based on competition either. Their terms of service are to be synchronized with those of top-level political appointees, i.e. if the minister leaves, heads and deputy heads of departments are dismissed too. This highlights the political nature of the appointments and undermines the stability and indeed impartiality of the Georgian civil service. These are significant changes which follow the architecture of a Russian power vertical, where all governmental roles are subordinate to the political whims of the Kremlin, and where loyalty and conformity is prized above competence and impartiality. Performance evaluations will be conducted twice a year instead of annually. Unsatisfactory performance evaluation would lead to a 20% pay cut. 2 unsatisfactory performance evaluations lead to dismissal without limited legal recourse, i.e. you can be fired on political grounds and you have no way of coming back and retaining your job or getting any kind of compensation for those poor decisions. This modification fundamentally modifies the performance evaluation process from being a performance management tool to being an administrative, punitive measure. Another bill under consideration aims to reshape police employment rules, enabling the minister to hand-pick employees without a competitive vetting process. Meanwhile, Georgian Dream lawmakers are considering a measure to increase police salaries, a move intended to reinforce the loyalty of police officers to the incumbent government. The loyalty of police officers to Georgian Dream may actually be shakier than appearances would suggest. Georgi Gaharia, a former Prime Minister and Minister of Internal Affairs who is now an opposition leader, said that over 100 officers have formally submitted resignation requests. The ministry refuses to accept them, leaving these officers in a state of limbo. The illegality and impunity of the new Georgian government has not gone totally unanswered. The US has announced sanctions against the billionaire founder and honorary chair of Georgian Dream, Bindiza Ivanishvili, for undermining the democratic and Euro-Atlantic future of Georgia to the benefit of the Russian Federation. The sanctions were announced Friday evening by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Ivanishvili and Georgian Dream's actions have eroded democratic institutions, enabled human rights abuses, and curbed the exercise of fundamental freedoms in Georgia, he said. Furthermore, they have derailed Georgia's Euro-Atlantic future, a future the Georgian people overwhelmingly desire and the Georgian constitution mandates, Blinken commented. The result has left Georgia vulnerable to Russia, which continues to occupy more than 20% of Georgia's territory. Blinken strongly condemned Georgian Dream's actions under Ivanishvili's leadership, including its ongoing and violent repression of Georgian citizens, protesters, members of the media, human rights activists, and opposition figures. Blinken emphasized the US is committed to promoting accountability for those undermining democracy and human rights in Georgia. The sanctions against Ivanishvili freeze his US assets, if indeed he has any, and prohibits US citizens and entities from conducting business with him without specific authorization from the US Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC. Whether this has any practical implications at this time were not revealed in Blinken's speech. The Treasury Department has also barred Ivanishvili from receiving $461 million in damages from the UBS Group AG, a multinational investment bank and financial services company, over a long-running legal battle with Credit Suisse, a bank that UBS acquired in March 2023. Ivanishvili had launched a new lawsuit against the troubled bank for $220 million. According to one article, Ivanishvili has already been awarded $1.34 billion by courts in Bermuda and Singapore over the affair, although Credit Suisse has vowed to appeal these decisions. Well, it looks like this process will be in limbo for some time as well. After these sanctions were announced, Georgian Prime Minister Irakli Kobakidze claimed that in reality nothing has changed. De facto sanctions were already in effect, and these de facto sanctions, informal sanctions, were in effect because of one thing: Ivanishvili did not give up the national interests of the country. Well, of course, this statement by the Georgian Prime Minister is disingenuous, as Ivanishvili is clearly working in the interests of Russia, not the Georgian people at all. The UK followed the US and acted in coordination with it by imposing sanctions on Georgian officials responsible for the brutal crackdown on media and protesters, including 5 Georgian officials for serious human rights violations. Georgia's Minister for Interior and the Director of the Tbilisi Police Department were among the 5 individuals sanctioned for violating human rights in Georgia. These sanctions follow action taken by the UK government last week to suspend support for the Georgian government programs and to restrict defence cooperation. Well, in conclusion, will any of this make a difference? Will it tip the balance in favour of the protesters? Well, it seems that these measures alone are likely not to really change anything on the ground, and certainly, even though they've been welcomed by the protesters, is unlikely to really advance their cause that much. We will, of course, report on developments in Georgia in the new year, and as things happen, we'll aim to report at least weekly or every other week on what is happening in this crucial region and how Russia's attempts at state capture are progressing.